Have you ever heard of a man who is so great that even his mistakes were considered genius? Meet Niels Bohr, the father of quantum physics. Our story begins in Copenhagen, Denmark, in 1885, where a baby boy was born to a wealthy Jewish family. His father was a successful banker, and his mother was a talented artist. From an early age, it was clear that the baby was extremely gifted. When he was just 2 years old, he was already assembling and disassembling watches. His parents were so proud of him. They hired private tutors for their son, but they had a hard time keeping up with him. At age 6, Niels was already solving math problems that were normally given to university students. When he started school, Niels quickly became the smartest kid in every class, but he was so arrogant that he often annoyed his teachers. One day, Niels' physics teacher asked him to calculate the speed of a pendulum. Niels looked at the pendulum for a while, then turned to his teacher and said, "You are wrong. Pendulums don't have any speed." The teacher was stunned and asked why. Niels replied, "If you swing a pendulum, it is going from one side to the other. It is not staying still. Therefore, it has speed." The teacher couldn't argue with this logic, so he gave Niels an A+. This happened often. Niels would always find a loophole in the lesson, which would make his teachers furious. Niels' arrogance did not go away during his teenage years. In fact, it got worse. When he was 16, he told his mom, "I have learned everything worth knowing. School is for fools, and I am no fool." After high school, Niels decided to study at the University of Copenhagen. He wanted to major in physics because he believed it was the most important subject. However, he soon realized that the professors didn't know any more than he did. So he started visiting the university library more often. There he would read books by himself and do experiments at home. In fact, Niels never attended a single physics lecture during his undergraduate years. Can you believe it? Despite this, Niels graduated with honors and got a job at a prestigious institute in England. He was so brilliant that he quickly became famous in the scientific community. But Niels was unhappy because he was still working alone. He really wanted to be part of a team, but no one wanted to work with him because he was too arrogant. Luckily, a famous physicist named J.J. Thomson noticed Niels' talent and invited him to work at Cambridge University. Finally, Niels was able to work with other brilliant minds, and he made some groundbreaking discoveries about the atom. But even at Cambridge, Niels couldn't keep his arrogance in check. He often argued with his colleagues and insulted them behind their backs. Eventually, his colleagues got fed up with his behavior and asked him to leave. But by this time, Niels had become famous enough that another university would happily hire him. So Niels packed his bags and moved to Manchester to take up a new job. In Manchester, Niels met a colleague named Ernest Rutherford, who was known for his explosive temper. At first, Niels and Ernest couldn't stand each other. They would argue about everything, but eventually they became friends. And when Ernest retired, Niels took over his position. Now he was in charge of an entire department, and he hired some of the brightest young minds in physics. Together, they made many incredible discoveries. But there was one problem. Even though Niels Bohr was a great scientist, he wasn't very good at managing people. He was constantly insulting his colleagues and students. And one day, he went too far. He was giving a lecture to a group of students when one of them raised her hand and asked a question. Niels looked at her and said, "You are so stupid. Even your question is stupid. Can you believe it?" But before the student could reply, Niels continued, "However, it is a very interesting question. Let me answer it." Then Niels proceeded to answer the question brilliantly. The students were stunned. They didn't know what to do. Should they get angry or should they be impressed? Niels knew exactly how to push people's buttons, and this time he had pushed them all the way. The next day, the students went to Niels' office to confront him. They told him that he had no right to insult them and demand an apology. But Niels simply laughed and told them to get out. That was the biggest mistake of his life. The students all quit working in his lab, and this caused a scandal. Niels' reputation was ruined, and no one wanted to work with him. It was the end of World War II, and many scientists were afraid that their research would be used to develop weapons. But Niels Bohr didn't care. He was more concerned with his own problems. He lost his job because of his arrogance, and no one would hire him again. But maybe this was a blessing in disguise, because Niels Bohr died only 2 weeks after his 60th birthday. If he had lived longer, he might have seen the error of his ways. But we will never know.